10. Mandela Way Tank. Introduced in 1940, the Soviet-built T-34 tank was famously used by the Red Army during the Nazi invasion of the USSR, also known as Operation Barbarossa. The tank quickly earned a reputation for its superiority to German tanks, with some Nazi leaders even admitting that they knew it was better than the equipment they were stuck working with. Many countries have used the T-34 tank, including Russia, Egypt, Afghanistan, China, and others. Consequently, there are numerous abandoned T-34s throughout the world, including one in London nicknamed Stompy. It was originally used by the Czech army and was decommissioned and sold following the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. From there, the tank went to London, where it was used as a prop in the British movie Richard III. After that, a local businessman named Russell Gray bought the tank as a gift for his son. However, he decided to use it as a tool for exacting revenge against the local city council. Russell wanted to build on an empty lot, but was denied. Gray parked the tank on the property, which sits at the corner of Mandela Way and Page's Walk, with its turret pointed in the direction of the city council. The council had approved Gray's request to install a tank at the site, but they'd mistakenly assumed he was referring to a septic tank on the application. Today, the T-34 remains parked at the site, where it's become a celebrated local fixture and is frequently painted over by graffiti artists. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the tank was painted blue in support of England's National Health Service. After that, it was painted green. In early 2022, the tank was temporarily removed from the site with plans to restore it to its former glory. 9. Cached Tank. Police in the northern German city of Kiel received an unusual call in 2015 when someone reported the local resident had a large collection of Nazi weapons in his basement. Members of law enforcement had allegedly discovered the elderly man's illicit hoard during a previous search of his home. Officers were shocked to find that the 84-year-old homeowner's cache consisted of dozens of rifles and machine guns, a torpedo, an anti-aircraft cannon, over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and most surprisingly, a 40-ton Panther tank. It took a group of 20 soldiers around 9 hours to remove the massive armored vehicle from the home. The manufacture, sale, and transport of war weapons are strictly regulated under Germany's War Weapons Control Act. Whether the senior citizen violated the act depends largely on how operational the weapons were when he bought them. The man claimed that the tank was just scrap metal that he bought in England. His lawyers argued that the vehicle and other items were non-functional, describing them as demilitarized historical museum objects. However, the court disagreed and ruled he'd broken the law. He received a suspended sentence of 10 months and was given 2 years to find a museum that's willing to take the tank and anti-aircraft cannon. The man was also fined €250, $297,000. 8. Tanks used as a coral reef. During the 1990s, surplus US Army tanks were sunk off the Florida and Alabama coast to be used as an artificial reef in an attempt to increase diving tourism. The first handful of M60 Patton tanks were dropped in 48-foot deep water off Miami Beach in 1994 as part of a plan to eventually sink 100 tanks throughout the following year, known as Project Reef X. Divers are able to enter the rear sections of the tanks, which house the engines and transmissions before they were removed. The hatches, however, are welded open and blocked by steel bars. Each tank weighs at least 45 tons and is capable of withstanding hurricane conditions. The M60 battle tank entered service in 1959. Although it was never officially coined a Patton tank, its design was based on the M48 Patton tank. It functioned as America's main battle tank throughout a large portion of the Cold War, during which time over 15,000 M60s were built. The military began retiring M60s after the Gulf War, with the last of the vehicles being taken out of service in 1997. 7. Narco tanks. In 2011, drug violence plagued central Mexico as conflict erupted within the Sinaloa cartel and between them and other cartels. Amid the chaos, there was a series of shootouts between cartel gunmen and local authorities in the state of Jalisco near the Zacatecas border. It was within this hotspot that police discovered a radically modified Ford F-Series Super Duty truck known as a narco tank. The unusual vehicle was plated with makeshift steel armor and had a metal cabin. It was equipped with a gun turret, along with a folding battering ram attached to the front bumper. Reports claim that the narco tank resembled 2 others belonging to the Zetas and Gulf cartels, although it's unclear which cartel was responsible for the one discovered in Jalisco. Narco tanks may sound like ramshackle impersonations of real tanks, but they're formidable in their own right. Some of them are equipped with advanced features like swiveling turrets and sniper peepholes. Law enforcement has been known to complain about cartels being better armed than they are, according to the BBC. Combating them is a daily uphill battle for those trying to do right by the law, not only because they have superior equipment, but because they have the influence and money to corrupt police for their cause. 6. Roadside tank. The Nebraska State Patrol received some unusual reports in 2020 from callers who claimed to see a trailer with a so-called tank on it. Troopers found the vehicle outside the town of Overton on the shoulder of an entrance ramp to Interstate 80, a 460-mile highway that cuts through the heart of the American Midwest. It was an unusual sight to say the least, especially since the drive along the rural route is typically rather uneventful, marked by little more than cornfields, vast plains, and the open sky. The driver of the abandoned truck and trailer was nowhere to be seen. Responding troopers noticed that it wasn't carrying a tank, but an armored military vehicle devoid of guns with large tracks. It was soon discovered that the vehicle belonged to the South Dakota National Guard, which had hired a company to move it back to South Dakota after it was used for a training exercise in California. The troopers reassured the public that they were looking for the driver, but they never provided any follow-up information about the strange situation. The vehicle did eventually disappear, leading to the safe assumption that it continued on to its destination at some point. What would you do if you saw what appeared to be an incomplete tank on the side of your local highway? Would you call the police or investigate? Let us know in the comment section below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button for more content.
Number 5.
Flamenco Beach Tanks. A collection of rusting, graffiti-covered World War II-era tanks dot the beach along Puerto Rico's Culebra Island. The decaying military vehicles look strangely out of place against the backdrop of snow-white sand and the pristine turquoise Caribbean Sea. The American military started using Culebra Island in 1901 after Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States as part of an agreement brokered at the end of the Spanish-American War. That same year, President Roosevelt gave usage rights of the island's public areas to the Navy. Although no official base was ever established there, the military carried out bombing and other weapons practice for decades. At one point, the military tried to evict the local population from the island. However, residents fought back by staging peaceful protests against the Navy's occupation of their home. They refused to give up until their voices were heard, and after realizing it was a losing battle, the military agreed to leave Culebra Island. Their presence was all but gone by 1975. Nearly all the smaller pieces of equipment that were initially left behind were removed, but the handful of tanks remain at the site today, rusting in the breeze. 4. Swamp Tank. In 2015, workers found an old Red Army tank buried in the muddy waters of a swamp outside the Belarusian town of Seno. Named after a Soviet Union marshal, it was identified as a KV-1 or Kliment Voroshilov-1 tank and may date as far back as 1940. The KV-1 was the Red Army's standard heavy tank when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. After rotting in the swamp for more than 70 years, the long-forgotten tank was recovered by salvage crews. Footage of the recovery showed that the turret was upside down and separated from the tank's chassis, indicating that the vehicle was riddled with electrical charges. There were also signs of possible fire damage. It's unclear whether the tank was destroyed and dumped on purpose, or if it got stuck in the mud and was damaged afterward. It's believed that the tank was used during the Battle of Seno, which went down in history as one of World War II's biggest tank battles. Around 2,250 tanks were involved in the battle, which happened in the region where the tank was found. 3. Urban Tank Graveyard. Lasting from 1961 to 1991, the Eritrean War for Independence is one of the longest conflicts in Africa's recent history. In what could perhaps be best described as an unlikely victory, Eritrea finally secured its freedom from Ethiopia after 30 years of fighting. The newly established country managed to defeat its adversary despite the Soviet Union's support of Ethiopia. Eritrean soldiers fought relentlessly despite a major lack of resources, with men often wearing sandals made from tire rubber and relying on weapons captured from the enemy. However, the Eritrean forces' determination to achieve sovereignty paid off. They refused to give up and managed to destroy a lot of the Ethiopians' equipment in the process. Worried that seeing evidence of their successes would boost the Eritreans' morale, Ethiopia stashed the damaged machinery out of view. In 1991, when Eritrea finally won the war, they amassed the hardware at a site located outside of the modern Eritrean capital, now known as the Tank Graveyard of Asmara. The equipment remains at the site on the city's outskirts to this day as a graveyard of rusting tanks and other vehicles. The site is open to the public, but very few international visitors gain access to it. Eritrea is second only to North Korea when it comes to the difficulty of getting a visa, and tourists are required to get an additional permit to visit the tank graveyard. 2. Fiat L640 tank. Designed and built by Fiat in 1940, the L640 was a light tank used by the Italian and Sicilian militaries throughout World War II. It was deployed in battles against the Soviet Union, as well as Italy's Balkans and North African campaigns. Only 3 of the armored vehicles are known to still exist today. One can be found in Albania outside Gjirokastër Castle. It was most likely used in the Balkans campaign, but little else is known about it. Gjirokastër Castle dates at least as far back as the 12th century and possibly even earlier. Today it operates as a military museum commemorating the communist struggle against imperialist Western powers. In addition to the L640 tank, the museum houses a captured US Air Force plane, as well as captured artillery from the Albanian resistance against German occupation during World War II. Despite its rich history, the fortress is a lesser-known tourist attraction. The decommissioned tank stands in solitude outside the fort, serving as a lonesome reminder of one of the darkest chapters in world history. The other 2 surviving L640s are in Lanano, Italy, and at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. 1. Tanks in Paradise. Sitting in the shallow, 13-foot deep waters just off Papua New Guinea are a pair of World War II-era tanks that were discovered in 2010 by Swiss diver and underwater photographer Franco Banfi. Despite their close proximity to the island, they remained undisturbed for more than 60 years. Each submerged tank weighs around 15 tons and is equipped with a cannon and 2 machine guns that are no longer functional. These vehicles played a key role in numerous crucial battles throughout the South Pacific, including the New Guinea campaign, which began in 1942 when Japan invaded Papua and New Guinea. The campaign continued until the war's end in 1945, at which point the 2 tanks were dumped into the water. This was a common way for American forces in the region to dispose of surplus equipment and vehicles. A lot of the time, the materials were in perfectly good condition, but it wasn't worth the cost of transporting them back to the US. Throwing them into the water was the best way to get rid of them without having to worry about them falling into enemy hands. Would you rather find out your neighbor is hoarding World War II surplus? 7. Violet Jessop. Violet Jessop survived not 1 but 3 shipwrecks. In 1887, she was born in Argentina. She traveled to England with her mum after her father passed away. Violet's mother found work as a stewardess on ships, and soon Violet followed in her footsteps. Violet was pretty, and to get the job, she made herself look less attractive than she actually was. This tactic worked, and she got onto one of the White Star Line's cruise ships, the Olympic, in 1910. After just a year on the Olympic, the ship hit the HMS Hawke, a military ramming vessel. Although Hawke's job was to sink enemy ships, both vessels were damaged, but neither sank in the accident, and Violet disembarked without incident. In 1912, the newest liner of the time, HMS Titanic, was looking for crew members for its maiden voyage. Violet took a job serving high-class passengers. On its way across the Atlantic Ocean, the Titanic sank in one of the most famous nautical disasters in history. Yet again though, Violet made it out alive, after being commanded to board a lifeboat to show upper-class women it was safe. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Violet decided to change careers and became a nurse. She still worked on a ship though, on the Britannic, the sister ship of the Olympic, and Titanic, which had been converted into a floating hospital for the war. Whilst patrolling the Aegean Sea, the Britannic boat struck a mine from a German U-boat. The ship began to take on water and sink. Violet wasn't able to reach a lifeboat in time, so she took her chances and jumped overboard. She hit her head on the keel of the boat, but amazingly managed to make it out alive and get rescued. Luck had been kind to Violet Jessop once again, and it was only years later that she found out she'd fractured her skull during the escape. Surviving 3 shipwrecks, Violet continued to serve on cruise liners until she retired at 61 years old, passing away in 1971 at the age of 84. 6. Harrison O'Keefe. Harrison O'Keefe was a cook for a Nigerian tugboat. In 2013, the boat was helping to stabilize an oil tanker when it was caught in a large wave, which caused it to start sinking. Most of the crew were locked in their rooms and asleep when this happened, since it was common practice to lock all doors to stop pirates in a raid. Harrison, though, was awake and in the bathroom, which would save his life. The tipping boat threw him off the toilet and shook him as the boat quickly sank. Harrison was lucky enough to tumble into a pocket of air as the ship hit the bottom of the ocean. The cook managed to keep his head above water by stacking 2 mattresses on top of each other so he could continue breathing. Harrison had to stay deadly still to remain inside the air pocket, and he did this with no food or water for over 60 hours until he was rescued by divers. Experts are blown away that he managed to remain calm and collected during the extreme situation, but also that the air pocket lasted for so long. The rescue crews now had to be careful, since Harrison had taken in a lot of nitrogen. If he were brought to the surface straight away, he would have gotten the bends, otherwise known as decompression sickness, which can be fatal. Instead, he was slowly brought out of the water in a special suit and immediately moved to a decompression chamber where he stayed for 2 days. Harrison was the sole survivor of the ship, not one to be kept down. He even qualified as a commercial diver later in 2015, with his rescuer being the person to give him his certification. 5. Morris and Marilyn Bailey. Morris and Marilyn Bailey were ready to head off on the trip of their life. The British couple had just sold all of their belongings to buy a 31-foot yacht named the Orlin, which they were going to sail to New Zealand with and start a new life. In June 1972, they left the port of Southampton to start their journey. Everything seemed to be going well, and by March the next year, they were close to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean. But tragedy struck when Orlin was hit by a sperm whale. The whale was bigger than the ship, measuring in at around 39 feet in length. As a result, the couple had to abandon ship and board a tiny inflatable life raft. The Baileys only had enough food to last them for 20 days. With no sign of rescue and still drifting at sea as their supply started to thin, they had to start eating raw sea turtles and sharks, drinking their blood to stay hydrated. Luckily, there was often a whole host of animals and fish circling the boat. They were never attacked, and instead the pair thought of the creatures as friends. The birds would even drop some of their catch into the raft for the couple to eat. After 117 days, the couple was finally rescued by a Korean fishing vessel, but it was bittersweet for them. They enjoyed their life on the water and felt like they were part of the ocean, like the animals they'd befriended. They returned to live in the UK afterwards, even publishing a book called 117 Days Adrift. Marilyn passed away from cancer in 2002, and Morris died alone 17 years later in 2019. How long do you think you could survive floating in the ocean? Let us know in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 4. Poon Lim. Poon Lim was born in 1918 in China. He had his first experience sailing as a cabin boy on a British ship. The experience was so harrowing with the abuse he experienced that he swore that he would not travel the seas again. But in 1941, an urgent call was made for all hands on deck by the British Navy for any able-bodied seamen in China to enlist and help the war effort. So, Poon Lim signed up to work on a ship once again. On November 10, 1942, he joined the British armed merchant vessel SS Ben Lomond as the second mess steward, and the ship set off to Brazil. It traveled without an escort, and although the vessel was armed, it was very slow. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 23rd, the Ben Lomond was spotted by a German U-boat. This was pretty unusual, given the fact that the ship was in South American, not European waters. Lim was launched into the water and scrambled to find a raft, but the only one he could see was captured and swept away by German forces. Poon Lim eventually managed to find an empty life raft. It was made from wood and had limited supplies that dwindled fast. Lim had to catch fish using wire from a flashlight, and he also caught seabirds to eat. 133 days later, Poon Lim was rescued by a Brazilian fishing crew after many other ships, both ally and enemy, had spotted and avoided him. After spending time in a hospital in Brazil, he eventually was taken to the UK, where he was awarded a British Empire Medal, by King George VI himself. Receiving this honor was not the only accolade Lim would be known for. At an astounding 133 days, he holds the record for the longest amount of time spent on a life raft. No wonder his experiences were used to rewrite the survival manuals of the British Royal Navy. 3. The whale ship Essex. Have you ever wondered where the inspiration for Herman Melville's famous book Moby Dick comes from? The answer lies in stories of the men from the American whaling ship named the Essex. The ship made its way out of port in Nantucket, ready for the long whaling vessel trip, a 2.5-year journey where they would hunt down sperm whales. Sperm whales were useful not only for their blubber, but also for the oil in their heads, which could be used to make things like cosmetics and oil for machines that powered the 19th century. As a result, the marine giants fetched a good amount of cash. Making their way into the South Pacific on November 20th, 1820, the Essex spotted a pod of whales and harpooned them using their smaller whaling vessels. But while the small boats were doing their job, one even getting towed by a whale in something the crew affectionately called a Nantucket sleigh ride, they were completely surprised by the huge whale that crashed into the main ship. The Essex sustained massive damage and sank, leaving only 21 people alive in 3 flimsy whaleboats with no main ship to return to. The survivors were 1,200 miles out from the closest landmass, with no food or water to sustain them. Before getting rescued months later, the boats were scattered by the waves, and most of the men had to face eating their crewmates in order to survive. Out of the 21 people that made up the Essex's crew, only 8 made it back to shore. 2. The Robertson family. During their 40-day voyage to the Marquesas Islands as part of a round-the-world trip, the Robertson family's boat, the Lucette, had already weathered many bad storms and bad weather. But there was one thing the ship would not be able to withstand: a pod of killer whales. The family was about 200 miles off the coast of the Galapagos Islands. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen downstairs, and 2 of the family's sons, including Donald, who was just 18 at the time, were standing in the cockpit when they saw a large black fin in the water. The ship was then rocked by 3 crashes. The force launched the 43-foot boat out of the water. One of the blows was met by a large cracking sound, which the family immediately recognized as the keel snapping in 2. The killer whales attacked the Lucette. One of them even had blood on its head from where it rammed so hard into the ship. The Lucette began taking on water almost immediately. The father of the family, Dougal, made the call for the family to abandon ship. It sank so quickly that there wasn't even time to send out a distress signal. The inflatable life raft became unusable after it was submerged on accident by a crew member. This only left a 10-foot wooden dinghy for 6 members of the Robertson family and their shipmate Robin Williams to cram into. Aware of the tropical heat, the Robertsons headed closer to the equator and the doldrums, renowned for its calm waters and little wind. This choice would save their lives. Despite remaining at a constant 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the weather conditions meant the water would evaporate quickly and easily into the clouds above, meaning that rain showers would be frequent and life-saving. The family survived by saving rainwater and eating sea turtles and fish. They aimed to save up as much as they could to eventually row across the Pacific to the USA. Even then, their hydration levels were so low that they didn't bleed if they accidentally cut themselves, so they resorted to drinking the fluid from fish eyes when there was not enough rainwater. Eventually, salvation came in the form of a Japanese fishing boat on July 23, 1972, their 38th day at sea. The Robertson family was unwell, but thankfully alive. 1. Jose Salvador Alvarenga. When fisherman Jose Salvador Alvarenga and his crewmate left Brazil on a fishing trip, little did he know that the next time he'd see land would be a year later. His tale of survival started on November 18, 2012, when their boat was caught in a storm 50 miles out at sea. The vessel quickly took on water, and it seemed unlikely they would make it back to shore. In the end, as the boat was taking on more seawater, they had to abandon their catch, tossing the fish that would have been a week's wages back into the sea. Jose and Cordoba, his shipmate, were able to finally remove the water from the boat, but by this point, they'd drifted miles out to sea, with no engine power and no navigational equipment. Eventually, after days of being stranded with no hope, they resorted to catching fish, including jellyfish, with their bare hands and drinking their own urine to stay alive. Although they managed to salvage some food that drifted by on the tides, after several months Cordoba started to grow sick from what they'd been eating and refused any more food they caught. Cordoba grew weaker and weaker until one day he started convulsing and eventually passed. Alvarenga was now alone. To keep himself sane, he thought of an imaginary world to cope. Time passed as container ships drifted by on the horizon, none of them spotting Alvarenga on his tiny boat. But fate smiled on the fisherman as he noticed a small island in the distance. Filled with hope, he gave everything he had to get to it, even cutting off buoys from the boat to get there faster. Once he reached shore, he didn't even have the strength to walk, dragging himself up the beach and to the forest of one of the islands of Ebon Atoll. Luckily, the island was inhabited by Emi Libokmito and her husband Russell Lykedrick. Although they did not understand each other, Russell was sent to get help the next day from the mayor on a neighboring island, and Alvarenga was eventually taken to a hospital. He had been at sea for 438 days and had traveled a staggering 7,000 miles away from home. Although severely malnourished and suffering from parasites due to his diet of fish and seabirds, Jose Salvador Alvarenga eventually made a full recovery. 4. Wessex Mk3 helicopter. In Tiddenham Quarry, located in Chepstow, England, a massive Wessex Mk3 helicopter sits at the bottom of the sea floor. Divers are taken down by a shuttle and then can explore the area, which just so happens to be full of underwater vessels. The development of the Mk3 started in 1995 with its forerunner, the Mk2. This was a model with 2 seats powered by a diesel engine. These engine types aren't typically seen in aircraft due to their relatively high mass-to-power ratio. Only one prototype was built of the Mk2. Years later, the Mk3 was introduced at the 2006 ILA in Berlin, powered by the same diesel engine. This 3-seater model is clearly copied from the Mk2. The frame is built from aluminium tubes and the cabin can be equipped with a glass cockpit. It's a modern-looking design, giving the pilot and passengers an excellent view of their surroundings with its large nose window section. The sunken Mk3 helicopter is located in the water at the National Diving and Activity Centre in Chepstow, England, and it's truly a horrifying sight to see. It's decrepit and rusted, but you can still clearly see the coat of yellow paint that covers the exterior of the cockpit. The aircraft is now mostly covered in green, slimy algae, and it's obvious that the years spent under the surface have not been kind to it. This particular Mk3 helicopter was deliberately sunk in December of 2007 and was sourced from the Royal Navy themselves. A 100-ton crane carefully lowered the craft into the water, and police specialist underwater and search teams assisted in getting it safely to the seafloor. Unfortunately, after 19 years in operation, the National Diving and Activity Centre is now closed to the public after a tragic incident in 2014 where a woman died while exploring the site, which only makes this place even more horrifying. 3. San Pedro de Alcantara. Historic shipwrecks litter the seafloor within Florida Keys National Maritime Sanctuary. The vessels are dispersed along coral reefs, partially hidden in muddy sands just a few miles from shore. A total of 9 ships have made their home here, all with their own unique stories to tell. The oldest of these ships that are found here is the San Pedro de Alcantara. It was built in 1770 with its main purpose to transport valuables. In 1784, the San Pedro traveled to Peru with 4 tons of gold, 153 tons of silver, and 600 tons of copper loaded on board from Peruvian mines. A collection of ancient ceramics that originated from the Chimu culture were also transported by the vessel, as well as political prisoners from the Tupac Amaru rebellion. The silver that was carried by the San Pedro were in the form of minted coins, and most of them were pieces of 8, which was a coin that represented the Spanish dollar. Unfortunately for the ship and its crew, the weight of the loot was too much for the vessel to bear, weighing twice as much as it should have. Before heading back to Spain, the captain warned that the boat would risk losing its bottom in a storm, but the advice was ignored and they set sail. During this journey, the San Pedro constantly leaked, which made it difficult for the crew to man the pumps. She had no choice but to port in Talcahuano, Chile, in order to be repaired before continuing their expedition. However, when the San Pedro rounded Cape Horn, she had to be fixed yet again in Rio de Janeiro. After making multiple stops, the ship continued its journey to Spain in early 1786. Unfortunately, the boat sank to a depth of 18 feet along the Portuguese coast after being caught in a hurricane on February 2, 1786. A full crew of 398 people had been on board when the tragedy occurred. 128 of them lost their lives that day. Spanish salvage operations began immediately, which was carried out by roughly 40 underwater divers. Even without the help of the gear and technology we have now, they still ended up bringing about 750 tons of cargo back to the surface over a period of 3 years. After most of its treasure had been recovered, the ship was almost forgotten about. It laid in that same spot for nearly 200 years. It wasn't until the 1960s that the wreck was rediscovered in Hawke Channel, which stretches from Biscayne National Park to Key West, which is only 1 mile south of Indian Key. The wreck has since become one of the most popular diving sites in the area, associated with the Silver Plate Fleet. Throughout the years, wreck divers have still been able to discover a plethora of silver coins dating back to the early 1700s, making this a rather productive site. Along with the various bits of treasure that have been recovered, the San Pedro has much more to offer to anyone that wants to explore the underwater sea. Tropical fish surround the sunken vessel and gather towards her keel and ribs, which have since been buried under the white sand at a depth of 18 feet. The battered remains of the San Pedro are enveloped by brilliant coral, seagrass, and various pieces of timber. Ballast stones from the ship make up a relatively large pile on the seafloor, about 30 feet wide and 90 feet long. There are red ladrillo bricks that can also be seen mixed in with the ballast, which once made up the base of the boat's galley stove. One of the most interesting things you can find in this shipwreck is the 1733 anchor, and it sits towards the north end of the ballast pile. A total of 7 cannons can also be seen strewn about the site, but 3 of them are hard to spot since they're mostly covered in sand. To make sure that divers know exactly where they are, a plaque is situated at the south end of the wreck. The plaque states that the site is identified as a state underwater archaeological preserve. The ship has definitely deteriorated over the years, and the rampant salvaging hasn't helped, but it's still a great place to visit if you're looking for an eerie new dive site to explore. Would you rather find a perfectly preserved diamond necklace or a bag of gold coins while exploring an underwater shipwreck? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe. 2. USS Kitewake. On July 10, 1945, the USS Kitewake was launched by the Savannah Machine and Foundry Company in Savannah, Georgia. It had been sponsored by Mrs. Howard S. Rue Jr. and was commissioned on July 18, 1946. After it was thoroughly tested to determine if it was seaworthy, the ship departed from Charleston, South Carolina, and made its first ever journey to Balboa Canal Zone on October 3rd. In the beginning of its service history with the US military, it was initially assigned to rescue duty and support with Submarine Squadron 6, Subron 6. The vessel was a submarine rescue ship, and it accompanied other submarines during maneuvers to monitor various diving operations, recover practice torpedoes, and practice underwater rescue operations. In late May of 1949, Kitewake left Balboa and headed to Norfolk, Virginia to continue to assist duty with Subron 6. Starting on January 17th of the next year, the 251-foot ship provided equipment and divers during salvage operations in order to free the Missouri, which was a battleship that had been grounded in tidal banks off the coast of Thimble Shoals. Then, in the 1950s, the vessel sailed to the Caribbean while it supported the Submarine Force US Atlantic Fleet ships. In 1959, the Kitewaki set a world record for completing the deepest submarine rescue exercise at a depth of 705 feet. Kitewaki was then stationed near Cape Canaveral, Florida, where she helped the USS George Washington launch the first two Polaris ballistic missiles that were ever fired from a submerged submarine. The ship operated out of Norfolk all the way until August 1961, which is when she set sail for Rota, Spain in the Mediterranean. While deployed with the US Sixth Fleet, it cruised from Spain to Greece and supported submarine maneuvers from Piraeus. In early February of 1963, the ship was on duty off Key West when it noticed the Jose Maria Perez, a Cuban boat, and rescued 12 refugees, 3 of which were children. The men and women were trying to escape communist oppression in their home country, and Kitewaki helped them make it safely back to US soil. Let's fast forward a bit to 1986. On January 28th, the Space Shuttle Challenger was set to launch into orbit. However, disaster struck and the craft broke apart just 73 seconds into the flight. Debris rained from the sky into the ocean, and interestingly, Kitewaki was responsible for recovering the Challenger's black box. In December 1989, the ship provided surface support throughout a Navy Trident missile test that took place in the Atlantic Ocean. But when Greenpeace learned of the testing, it sent ships to protest the exercises. Greenpeace began attacking the USS Kitewaki by ramming the bow of their ship into the Kitewaki's aft port side, but the ship fought back. The water vessel then hit the Greenpeace ship hard as a return of aggression, which disabled their engines, leaving their boat dead in the water. Then, just 5 years later, USS Kitewaki was ordered to be decommissioned, and it was also removed from the Naval Vessel Register on the same day of September 30th, 1994. The title of the ship was then sold to the Cayman Islands government for an undisclosed amount of money. The territory wanted to acquire the ship so they could turn it into an artificial reef, but the Kitewaki's title wasn't transferred until November of 2008. Finally, in 2011, the vessel was sunk just off the coast of 7 Mile Beach, Grand Cayman on January 5th in Marine Park. The ship had a long history, and oddly enough, it now rests on the sand in shallow waters. The depth of the ship, around 60 feet, makes it an extremely popular diving site for scuba divers, freedivers, and snorkelers. The waters surrounding the ship are crystal clear, making it easily visible from the surface, and the incredibly preserved appearance of the vessel makes it a truly eerie sight to behold. The highlights of the submarine include the tall smokestack and the giant propellers, the mess hall, 2 recompression chambers, and the head is complete with an unbroken mirror. In early 2017, Kitewaki's famous wheelhouse had the panels removed after it was damaged in a storm, but you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at the wreck. Divers are even able to pose at the captain's wheel for pictures. Sadly, when Tropical Storm Nate hit the area, the ship's anchor chains were snapped, which caused Kitewaki to be pushed onto its port side. And even though the sunken vessel may look terrifying to some people, it's doing wonders for the local marine life. All over the shipwreck, you can find arrowhead crabs, peppermint shrimp, and fireworms. Garden eels have made their homes in the sand surrounding Kitewaki, which attracts eagle rays and southern stingrays to the ship as well. If you are planning to go on a diving expedition anytime soon, this is an opportunity that may be too good to refuse. 1. M42 Duster. At Tank Reef in Aqaba, Jordan, there is an entire underwater area covered with sunken tanks. This project began back in 1985 when King Abdullah II decided that a Lebanese freighter called the Cedar Pride needed to be repurposed as an artificial reef. In 1998, another wreck was added to the site, but this time it was done by the Jordanian Royal Ecological Diving Society, JEDS. The American-built M42 Duster tank served as the first ever tank of the reef. This vehicle was a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. Construction for the M42 tank began in 1952 and was completed in December of 1960 for the United States Army. The tank division of General Motors Corporation was responsible for the production of this vessel. It was in service until 1998, with only 3,700 of them ever made. It could seat 6 people, and it weighed 49,500 pounds. These tanks assisted ground forces throughout the Vietnam War, but newer models had already been in production by the time the war ended, and they were no longer needed after that. The M42 is located only 66 feet from the shore, and it sits roughly 20 feet below the surface. It looks fairly fragile now, as it sits on the sandy ocean bottom, with algae and other plant life growing out of the sides of the craft. Nevertheless, it's still an interesting and rather haunting dive site for anyone that enjoys military history. Which one of these haunting underwater vessels would you most like to visit on your next diving expedition? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.